Okay, let's unpack this. We have an incredible, really dense stack of sources for this deep dive, covering the absolute top global flashpoints that have defined the beginning of 2026.
Right.
And if you came here looking for a comfortable surface-level news roundup, you might want to prepare yourself.
Uh-huh. This isn't that.
This isn't a quick skim. It's an intensive examination of these converging global crises, international instability, and crucially, the ethical calculations or miscalculations behind it all.
And that last point is really our mission today. We're not just here to report the headlines.
No.
We are diving into the source material that defines the stakes. We have the hard reporting from Global Flashpoints, Power, Protest, and the 2026 Horizon, which it lays out the facts on the ground across Venezuela, Iran, and Ukraine.
But what gives this deep dive its true intellectual depth, I think, is the companion analysis. It's called The Moral Vacuum, Power and Justice at the Crossroads. And this second source, it just forces us to weigh the geopolitical movements, the military actions, the summits, the economic decisions, and ask, what is the true cost of all this strategic expediency?
And the sources, they make this foundational argument right at the top.
Which really dictates our whole analysis today. So.
Exactly. It's that these events, Venezuela, Iran, Ukraine, they aren't isolated crises.
That are connected.
They're symptoms of a deeper disorder in the international system, one that, according to the analysis, has systematically begun prioritizing raw power over principle.
Power over principle, that's the phrase.
It is. And we are going to explore how that tension, that moral crossroads, is playing out in real time across the globe. Our goal is to really distill these key geopolitical shifts and try to understand the why behind the instability we're seeing.
Okay, so let's jump straight into our first flashpoint. This one has just dominated the Western Hemisphere's political landscape. The high-stakes situation in Venezuela. We're specifically focused on the anticipated, and I should add, highly controversial, meeting between U.S. President Donald Trump and Venezuelan opposition leader Maria Corina Machado. This is where the stated ideals of democratic restoration clash head-on with what looks like undeniable strategic convenience.
It's a remarkable piece of political theater, and it's largely because of the moral standing that Machado brings to the table.
She's not just any politician.
Not at all. She isn't merely a political rival. The sources really highlight that she is the winner of the 2025 Nobel Peace Prize.
Which is huge.
It's massive. And that recognition wasn't simply ceremonial. It was for her, decades-long advocacy for democratic transition and, critically, for the release of political prisoners.
And that's become a litmus test for the country's ethical direction, hasn't it?
It really has.
And she is leveraging that moral capital brilliantly. I mean, the sources detail how, in the lead-up to her White House visit, she secured a high-profile meeting with Pope Leo XIV.
Yes, that was a very strategic move.
Incredibly, that sought-after religious and moral endorsement is absolutely critical because it attempts to place her democratic movement above the fray of purely geopolitical maneuvering.
It frames it as a moral cause, not just a political one.
Exactly. It helps build a coalition based on, universal values, not just U.S. strategic needs.
But the reality of this summit, the context, is inseparable from the immediate volatile situation on the ground.
Right.
The sources remind us that this meeting is happening amid significantly escalated U.S. involvement in Venezuela.
And when you say escalated, what are we talking about specifically?
We're talking about recent controversial military strikes and the dramatic capture of the former leader, Nicolas Maduro.
So this wasn't just diplomatic pressure.
Oh, no. These were unilateral actions that, while they achieved the immediate goal of decapitating the regime, they introduced profound international controversy and, frankly, a lot of internal resistance.
And that's the core tension, isn't it? You can't just unilaterally decide the internal political structure of a sovereign nation, no matter how you justify it at home, without facing significant pushback.
You can't. And the critique leveled in the source material is that these actions, even when they're aimed at restoring democracy, can look disturbingly similar to regime change when framed by the international community.
Especially from others in the region.
Especially.
Yeah.
Which takes us directly to the U.S. strategic imperatives, which the analytical sources just lay bare.
Okay, what are they?
The primary aim, according to the documents we have, appears to be dual and tightly linked to the economic ledger.
So politics and money.
Always. First, there's the political goal, solidifying a pro-Western regime that ensures future cooperation. Simple enough.
And second?
Second, and far more economically impactful, is the aim to secure Venezuela's vast oil resources.
And when we talk about oil here, we really need to inject the specific detail to grasp the stakes. Yeah. This isn't just a minor resource play.
Not even close. The sources emphasize that Venezuela's reserves are estimated to outsize those of any other nation on the planet,
Including Saudi Arabia.
including Saudi Arabia. We are talking about hundreds of billions of barrels of proven reserves. This isn't a side benefit of the policy.
No, it's central.
Securing this supply chain under favorable terms would fundamentally shift global energy dynamics for decades to come.
So that massive economic driver is the elephant in the diplomatic room, as the critique noted, and it really needs more examination.
Let's follow that elephant. The juxtaposition is just so stark. On one hand, you have the stated ideals of supporting a Nobel laureate for democracy.
A very noble cause on its face.
Very. But on the other hand, you have the geopolitical reality of securing the world's largest oil supply. This leads directly to the uncomfortable question that's raised by the moral vacuum.
Which is?
Is the core concern truly the well-being and democratic future of the Venezuelan people, or is it fundamentally about control over Venezuela's resources and its strategic position?
And the sources suggest that the U.S. has invested such massive political and military capital. We're talking about the deployment of highly advanced air assets for the strikes that led to Maduro's capture. That the implicit promise from a new regime has to be loyalty.
Right. A loyalty that could potentially overshadow genuine democratic mechanisms.
It's a quid pro quo.
In a sense. And that tension, it undermines the very concept of legitimacy, which is the cornerstone of democratic governance.
How so?
Well, the expert insight in the sources notes this immense challenge in legitimizing Machado's leadership on the international stage. While she's being celebrated by certain external powers, like the U.S., her ability to establish control without broad internal unity and infrastructure presents a massive hurdle. The sources really question whether a government can truly be legitimate if its establishment required significant external military force and lacks that immediate unified grassroots consent.
It's the classical, almost tragic dilemma of externally driven transition, but this time it's being played out on a high-stakes energy chessboard.
It is. And the analysis from the moral vacuum is crystal clear on this. Political legitimacy cannot be manufactured from foreign endorsement alone.
It has to come from within.
It must be born from the consent, the unity, and the welfare of the people themselves. If that foundation is missing, if local security forces or regional governors still harbor deep resentment over the foreign intervention, any transition, no matter how strongly it's branded as democratic, risks deepening those internal fractures.
And that could lead to long-term civil instability.
Exactly. The warnings in our source material are, frankly, chilling. They caution that if external powers pursue influence without significant humility and sustained restraint.
And what does restraint mean in this context?
It means pulling back on the military presence, allowing genuine internal political processes to flourish without an American shadow over them.
Okay.
If that doesn't happen, Venezuela may simply exchange one form of instability for another. The sources explicitly suggest the humanitarian suffering risks being prolonged, even as oil revenues start to flow.
And we're already seeing the regional impact of this dichotomy. Latin American governments are sharply split.
Oh, completely.
Nations like Colombia and Peru, who are already dealing with massive migration crises from Venezuela, have urged immediate democratic reform. They're generally aligning with the U.S. goals.
But then you have the other side.
Right. Conversely, nations like Cuba and Bolivia have condemned the U.S. actions as blatant sovereign overreach, which is further polarizing regional institutions like the Organization of American States.
So the unity that would be required for a stable regional solution is just, it's evaporating.
It is.
So that's the diplomatic cost. The U.S. has achieved a swift strategic victory. Maduro is gone, but it has paid a very steep price in terms of moral authority and regional goodwill.
And the analysis suggests that the long-term success of the Machado administration will hinge not on that initial White House photo op, but on her ability to integrate former rivals, demobilize resistance groups, and demonstrate a commitment to national reconciliation that actually transcends the interests of Washington.
A very tall order.
So what's the concrete takeaway for you, the listener, as this unfolds? What we need to watch is whether this summit yields tangible transition plans, real practical steps towards verified multi-party elections, infrastructure rebuilding, genuine reconciliation, or if it simply results in a highly publicized but ultimately superficial reaffirmation of geopolitical alignment.
The risk is high. The
All right.
risk is that strategic oil interest will eclipse the moral necessity of true internal unified support for a new government.
Okay. That was a deep dive into how strategic self-interest is challenging the very foundation of democratic support in Latin America.
Hmm.
Now, we have to move continents. We're shifting our attention from the strategic theater of Caracas to a profound internal moral crisis in the Middle East, Flashpoint Iran.
And this represents a different and, you could argue, more devastating kind of instability where a state is actively turning its weapons inward against its own population.
The situation in Iran is just. It's truly dire. The country is enduring the broadest and most sustained anti-government protests it has experienced in years.
And the initial fuse, as so often happens, was economic distress.
Can you quantify that? How bad is it?
The sources quantify this pain very clearly. The Iranian currency, the rial, has seen a catastrophic collapse. It's lost an estimated 80% of its value against the dollar over the preceding 6 months.
80%. That isn't just inflation. That is an economic annihilation that hits the streets the hardest.
It is. It devastates the import sector, leading to crippling shortages of everything from medicine to basic food stuff.
So what started as frustration over, financial pain, the cost of bread, has now morphed into something much bigger.
It's rapidly morphed into widespread, fervent, and organized calls for profound political change, for the overthrow of the clerical leadership itself.
And the regime's response?
It's been predictable, but staggering in its brutality. It confirms the worst feels about power when it's divorced from any ethical limits. The scale of the crackdown is systemic.
What does that look like on the ground?
The sources detail a deliberate nationwide information blackout. Internet and telephone services have been nearly shut down across the entire country.
And that's not random. That's a strategy.
It's a classic tactic of isolating dissenters, preventing the coordination of protests, and severely limiting any outside reporting on what is truly happening.
That information vacuum must make getting accurate numbers impossible.
It does. Precise casualty counts are impossible, but the independent monitors cited in the source material, they paint a terrifying picture. Reports suggest hundreds, possibly even thousands of deaths in clashes between demonstrators and security forces.
And that includes the Revolutionary Guard.
Yes,
Yeah.
including the IRGC. And furthermore, there's been a massive wave of arrests, with estimates putting the number of detained individuals well above 10,000.
10,000 people.
At least.
And how is the government justifying this? What's the official line?
The government's rhetoric is designed to justify this overwhelming repression. We are talking about the traditional economic bedrock, the bazaar merchants, who usually remain politically quiet. We're talking about university students representing the future, and critically disaffected, underemployed urban youth.
So you have the old guard, the new generation.
The economic elite and the unemployed. When these highly diverse groups converge in such numbers against the clerical leadership, it signals an opposition that is deep, systemic, and widespread.
Which confirms the analysis from the moral vacuum.
It does. The unfolding tragedy is a stark reminder of what happens when a government entirely loses its moral credibility and its connection to its own people.
So the analysis poses a kind of fundamental ethical diagnosis here.
It does.
Yeah.
When a state responds to its citizens' grievances about dignity, accountability, and the right to simply earn a living with bullets, mass arrests, and information blackouts, it reveals a profound fear.
A fear of what?
The source states it unequivocally. The fear is not of foreign enemies crossing a border, it's the fear of its own people demanding change.
So that shift from governance to pure self-preservation via terror.
That is the ultimate ethical failure of the state.
How has the international community reacted?
The international reaction has been cautious, given the geopolitical sensitivity, but it is certainly escalating.
What are the Americans doing?
President Trump's administration is reportedly weighing a spectrum of options. It ranges from crippling tariffs, targeting countries that continue to trade with Iran, designed to intensify that economic pressure, to even possible military action in the Gulf.
The military action is still a last resort.
The sources emphasize that diplomacy and targeted sanctions remain the primary choice for now.
And the Europeans. Historically, they've been more focused on diplomacy with Tehran.
They have, but they have definitively condemned the crackdown. They've moved quickly to impose new sanctions targeting specific elements of the regime responsible for human rights abuses.
And travel bans.
Yes, they've banned certain Iranian diplomats from traveling within the Schengen zone.
But the sources, they raise a critical ethical point for these foreign powers, don't they?
They do. No society can achieve stability through state-sponsored terror. Force may silence voices temporarily, but it can never erase the underlying injustice.
So there's a warning here about outside interference.
A strong one. The analysis cautions against external interference that aims merely to exploit this genuine internal unrest for geopolitical advantage.
Because that would risk turning profound human suffering into, what, an international pawn?
Precisely. And that ultimately harms the very people the West claims to support.
Let's talk about the serious, specific geopolitical implications of this, because this isn't just happening in a vacuum.
No, not at all. First, Iran's instability threatens to destabilize an already incredibly volatile Middle East. If the regime collapses, or if it resorts to aggressive external actions to distract its population,
It could draw in other players.
you could easily draw in regional players like Saudi Arabia or Israel, dramatically escalating tensions in the Gulf.
And second, and this is highly relevant to our discussion of global convergence,
Yes, Iran's turmoil intensifies the great power rivalry. Tehran has deepened its military and economic ties with Russia over the last year, largely in response to Western sanctions.
so Russia has their back.
And this alignment complicates any unified Western response to the human rights crisis. It creates a diplomatic obstacle course where every action you take in Tehran must be weighed against its effect on Moscow.
So the ultimate question for the region is whether this combined pressure, internal dissent, and international isolation can force political concessions from the clerical regime, or whether this instability will simply embolden the hardliners to tighten their control even further, leading to a prolonged period of internal conflict.
And the analysis concludes that lasting peace in Iran can only come through reconciliation, fundamental reform, and a restoration of respect for human life.
Repression only buys time.
And external manipulation often backfires. The ethical failure here is complete when a government systematically sacrifices the welfare and dignity of its own people just for self-preservation.
Okay, so we've established two major global points where domestic unrest, the leadership contest in Venezuela, and the civilian revolt in Iran have immediately transformed into international flashpoints, diverting global attention and resources. Now, we must shift our focus to the third major crisis, the prolonged war in Ukraine, which, while it's geographically distinct, is deeply interconnected through its immense strain on diplomatic capacity and global resource allocation.
Indeed. The conflict in Ukraine remains just relentlessly intense. Our sources report that Russia is maintaining its offensive capacity, launching major assaults across key fronts.
So this shows that the sheer scale of their mobilization continues to supply the war machine.
It does. This is a sustained, grinding war of attrition. This is not a frozen conflict.
And at the same time, the military support flowing into Ukraine continues at a rapid pace.
It does. The sources specifically highlight that the UK is racing to supply Ukraine with next-generation, long-range precision missile systems.
And why is that so significant?
It's significant because these systems are designed to reach deeper into occupied territory and target logistical hubs. It directly escalates the capacity for kinetic action and raises the prospect of strikes further inside Russian-held territory,
So you have this constant influx of high-tech weaponry and the continued Russian offensives.
which just sustains an environment of profound attrition. The reporting underscores persistent shelling, widespread drone strikes, and just substantial military losses on both sides.
It feels like a stalemate.
It is. Despite all the advanced technology and strategic shifts, neither side seems able to secure a decisive, war-winning victory. It remains a stalemate measured in territory gained and lost, street by street.
And the analysis in the moral vacuum offers a sobering, almost painful indictment of this.
It does. The war in Ukraine, sustained by these massive injections of advanced weapons, expanding alliances, and unrelenting offensive strategies, has failed to produce any meaningful victor or positive outcome.
The only tangible results, according to the sources,
We're expanding cemeteries, millions of refugees, and shattered, unlivable cities.
and this leads the sources to question the fundamental necessity of the ongoing escalation.
It does. Every increase in arms supply, every new offensive, is justified by one side or the other as necessary for self-defense or for securing peace.
But the analysis argues that the definition of necessity itself has become dangerously elastic.
Exactly. When advanced weapons flow more freely and rapidly than diplomatic proposals or aid for reconstruction, the physical and moral space for peace just shrinks dramatically.
The momentum is for destruction, not compromise.
That's it.
That's where the challenge of moral courage enters the equation. History teaches us that wars sustained by pride, by perceived strategic necessity, and proxy interests rarely end purely on the battlefield.
No, they don't. They end when leaders on all sides rediscover the courage to compromise, to de-escalate, and to accept a painful, imperfect peace over continued costly war.
And if that doesn't happen,
If moral restraint is not restored, if this cycle of escalation continues, fueled by external supply, the conflict in Ukraine risks draining not just the resources and populations of Ukraine and Russia, but the ethical credibility of the entire global order.
the sources suggest that by prioritizing arms flow over persistent high-level diplomatic efforts, the West risks becoming complicit in the perpetuation of this attrition.
It's a harsh assessment, but it's a vital one, given the sheer duration and the human cost.
So now we have to tie these three flashpoints together: Venezuela, Iran, and Ukraine. Because the most critical takeaway from our source material is the sheer impact of their convergence on global systems.
Absolutely. The geopolitical flashpoints are converging, and this is the unifying theme of early 2026. Iran, Venezuela, and Ukraine all draw significant, complex global power interests, from oil supply chains and energy security to the great power rivalry between Moscow, Beijing, and Washington.
And this convergence, it strains global diplomatic bandwidth severely. I mean, just think about the daily pivots required of policymakers.
It must be exhausting.
One day, they are focused on preventing escalation in the Middle East following the brutal Iranian crackdown. The next, they have to sustain a massive proxy war in Eastern Europe. The day after that, they are attempting to legitimize a new regime and secure oil deals in Latin America.
And the sources are really blunt on this point. When global crises multiply, the capacity for effective, nuanced management diminishes.
And the risk of miscalculation goes way up.
It skyrockets. A mistake in handling the Iranian crisis, for instance, could easily be exploited by Russia, or vice versa. It could turn one regional problem into an interconnected, multi-continent crisis.
And we have to reiterate that key theme. Domestic unrest is transforming immediately into international flashpoints. The mass movements in Iran and the leadership contest in Venezuela, they illustrate how internal dissent, which should be resolved internally, immediately complicates U.S. and European foreign policy priorities.
Our systems just don't have the capacity to manage three such resource-intensive crises simultaneously without severe overstretch.
And what about the secondary effects of the war in Ukraine?
Well, the prolonged conflict has specific secondary effects that drain resources globally. The massive, sustained military commitment by NATO members will inevitably drive deeper NATO cooperation, certainly.
But also sharply increased defense spending.
Yes. The sources project defense budgets across Europe to reach historically high percentages of GDP. That's massive capital being shifted away from domestic priorities, climate resilience, or humanitarian aid.
So this institutional and financial commitment to conflict further strains resources.
It's a zero-sum game played with human resources and money. The world is allocating vast sums to weapons and defense, which ultimately means those funds are not available for addressing the underlying humanitarian crises in places like the Levant or the environmental degradation we see elsewhere.
So we have instability, repression, and prolonged conflict defining the geopolitical landscape of 2026.
But how does this immense global anxiety translate into the systems we interact with every day? The markets, culture, soft power?
Okay, let's transition now to Section 4, economic anxiety and cultural soft power.
Despite all this turmoil, the sources note a genuinely peculiar phenomenon, what they term Wall Street's fragile calm.
Fragile calm.
Yes. After several periods of turbulence directly tied to this geopolitical risk specifically, tensions around Iran and oil, the Venezuelan intervention, the unpredictable nature of U.S. trade policy, U.S. equity markets have recently stabilized.
And some analysts took that as a good sign.
To some, it suggested investor confidence was returning, or at least that markets had priced in the current level of risk.
But fragile is the operational word there.
It is. The volatility seen earlier in the year was driven by very specific ongoing risks, not just general nervousness. We saw massive swings tied directly to uncertainty over Iran and the critical oil markets.
Any threat to Gulf shipping or Iranian oil production just sends seismic waves through energy prices.
It does. And you couple that with the unpredictability of President Trump's tariff announcements and the general risk aversion tied to any military escalation, and you have a highly nervous investment climate.
So the stabilization then is deceptive.
Very. And this is where that powerful moral critique of markets from the moral vacuum enters the discussion.
What's the critique?
The expert view notes that markets react not to justice or injustice, but purely to predictability and the potential for profit. So this current stability is purely superficial and profoundly fragile. It's built on the assumption that the crises in Caracas and Tehran won't get dramatically worse.
And we have to ask, what happens when the underlying human suffering is just ignored by the market?
The analysis states explicitly that economic systems divorced from ethical considerations will eventually destabilize themselves because they ignore the true costs of conflict and repression.
For instance, stability in oil futures might reflect a secured Venezuelan supply.
But that stability is built on the contentious political transition we just spent 10 minutes discussing.
It's a house of cards.
It is. The analysis delivers a very sharp, uncompromising warning. Prosperity that is built on human suffering or the systematic disregard for human dignity is inherently temporary.
So if the world remains morally incoherent,
Prioritizing short-term strategic gains over long-term ethical sustainability, markets will continue to oscillate wildly between superficial confidence and deep-seated fear, easily shattered by the next crisis that erupts.
so nations, aware that military power and economic indices don't paint the full picture, they often try to manage their global image through cultural soft power, specifically sports.
Yes, and this strategy is highlighted by the source material's focus on Qatar and women's football.
What's happening there?
Qatar, already a major hub for international events, is actively in high-level discussions with FIFA to host the inaugural Women's Club World Cup, tentatively scheduled for January 2028.
That's a huge event for women's soccer.
It's a landmark event, and securing it signals not just shifting centers of sports diplomacy, but a concerted effort by the Gulf nation toward international branding and normalizing its position on the global stage.
But it immediately raises profound ethical questions, especially when you look back at the past controversies surrounding labor practices and human rights related to mega events in the region.
Absolutely. The sources insist that while sport undeniably has the power to unite and inspire, it provides that momentary respite from the chaos. This positive force is only genuine if the hosting nation demonstrates a real, sustained commitment to fairness, dignity, and inclusion.
So the analysis poses a challenge.
It does. Can the cultural power of women's sports elevate the region's ethical standards? Or will the region's geopolitical imperatives simply absorb and utilize the sport's prestige?
Otherwise, this source's caution, it just risks becoming another instrument of image management.
A form of sports washing.
Right. Rather than a true driver of social and political progress, the focus shifts from celebrating athletic achievement to managing global optics.
And we see similar logistical and ethical strains when we examine the upcoming 2026 Winter Olympics in Milan and Cortina, Italy.
What are the issues there?
The operational challenges are mounting, largely due to systemic delays. The sources flag specific construction issues, noting significant delays at the crucial ice hockey arena, which is a major anchor venue for the Games.
And that logistical concern has immediate real-world consequences. It impacts athlete preparations, travel, ticketing, broadcasting.
And the underlying infrastructure. It adds immense pressure on the Italian organizers to deliver world-class venues under extreme haste, which often sacrifices quality or worker conditions.
And the reflection from the moral vacuum notes that these delays are more than just logistical hiccups.
Right. They are symptomatic of how modern mega events strain systems that are already stretched thin by economic anxiety and global supply chain issues, many of which are exacerbated by the very flashpoints we've been discussing.
So the ethical challenge is paramount. Global prestige projects must never overshadow the responsibility to local communities, workers, and the athletes themselves.
And the sources warn that excellence achieved through immense haste and last-minute scrambling often conceals significant hidden costs in worker safety, budgetary overruns, and ultimately environmental sustainability.
Thankfully, amid this relentless news cycle of conflict and ethical dilemmas, the sources do offer a brief, welcome respite.
The scheduled Australian Open 2026.
Yes. This start to the international tennis season is noted as a necessary, temporary pause from the heavy geopolitical news cycle that dominates the rest of the calendar.
It's a valuable moment. It reminds humanity that sport, at its best, still embodies clear rules, discipline, mutual respect, and fair competition.
Values desperately needed across the geopolitical sphere, but which are increasingly absent in Caracas, Tehran, and Kyiv.
And before we transition to our final synthesis, the sources briefly note key regional dynamics in Southeast Asia, specifically looking at emerging economies like Vietnam and Cambodia.
And why is this important?
The importance of Southeast Asia here is purely as a contrast point to the global flashpoints. While the individual developments in these nations may be smaller in global impact than the conflicts we've covered, they collectively demonstrate a regional dynamism.
So what's the key insight here?
The key insight the sources provide is that progress need not be violent or immediately confrontational to be meaningful. Gradual reforms and governance experiments show an alternative, less chaotic path forward.
Especially when you compare it to the volatility engulfing Venezuela or Iran.
It's a reminder that stability is achievable through process and patience, not just through overwhelming force.
That distinction, violent confrontation versus quiet progress, is a powerful framework for our final section. We have navigated the specifics of 3 major crises and examined their influence on markets and culture. Now we have to turn to the larger moral picture, synthesizing the overarching truths and ethical failures identified in the source material.
And our analysis confirms that the world is indeed standing at a moral crossroads, one where strategic interests, oil, great power competition, image management, often ruthlessly override foundational humanitarian principles.
So these crises are fundamentally ethical failures first and political or military struggles second.
That's the argument.
So what does this accumulation of evidence mean for you, the listener? The sources offer 3 overarching truths that tie all these events together, spanning Caracas, Tehran, and Kyiv, highlighting that common thread of the moral vacuum.
The first truth is clear. Power without justice breeds instability.
Explain that.
In every flashpoint we examined, from the pursuit of dominance without moral restraint in Venezuela to the systematic brutality of the repression in Iran, the result is prolonged suffering and renewed chaos. Force and strategic maneuvering can never create lasting peace or true stability if justice, accountability, and consent are absent.
So the source is arguing that instability isn't a consequence of failure. It's an inevitable byproduct of injustice itself.
That's it, exactly.
The second truth is deeply unsettling, and it connects directly to the economic critique we discussed earlier.
Yes, human dignity is the missing metric.
I mean, global discourse habitually measures success in terms of influence, market stabilization, or military strength. We obsess over oil reserves, missile supplies, tariff impacts.
But the sources point out that success is rarely measured in the actual human well-being, the dignity, or the welfare of ordinary people in the streets of Tehran or the refugee camps near Kyiv.
And this absence of a human focus leads directly to the third and perhaps most actionable truth.
Peace requires moral courage.
And this is not the courage to fight, to arm more allies, or to escalate conflict.
No. It is defined by the source material as the courage to listen, the courage to exercise strategic restraint even when short-term gain is tempting, and the political courage to reconcile opposing views and invest in a peace that demands painful compromise.
We have to acknowledge the crushing complexity of these converging crises. The threat of miscalculation is huge, and the ethical accountability demanded by these events weighs heavily on global leaders.
It does, and the path ahead is difficult, but the sources imply that without a serious collective reevaluation of ethical principles, a refusal to operate in this moral vacuum, we are doomed to repeat this cycle of violence and instability indefinitely.
That's a challenging thought.
The reflection offered by the analysis is that until world leaders learn that genuine peace cannot be engineered solely through military might, and stability cannot be enforced without compassion and justice, the cycle of unrest and human suffering we've observed at the start of 2026 will continue. It will simply shift geography.
It's a heavy thought to end on, but it's essential to absorb the full weight of the sources we've analyzed today. These events demand more than just our attention. They demand ethical clarity.
Indeed. And we leave you with a final provocative thought, drawn directly from the source reflection on this moment in history. When future generations look back on 2026, the criteria for judgment will be clear, but maybe unexpected.
History will not ask who possessed the greatest weapons or the largest piles of wealth.
Wow.
It'll ask who stood for humanity when it mattered most.